Blind black Vietnam veteran is ridiculed by famous pianist. Then he plays a song that surprises everyone. Get that black man off the stage. He's blind. He'll ruin the Bosendorfer. The cutting voice of conductor Richard Wellington echoed through the empty auditorium like a merciless sentence. In the center of the stage, illuminated by a single spotlight, stood Thomas Miller, 68, a Vietnam veteran, holding his white cane as his fingers brushed the polished concert piano. In the center of the stage, illuminated by a single spotlight, was Thomas Miller, 68, a black Vietnam veteran, holding his white cane while his fingers brushed the polished concert piano. Nervous laughter from the sound technicians and some musicians filled the space. Thomas stood motionless, his upright posture betraying years of military training. His facial scars were silent witnesses to what he had lost in Southeast Asia nearly 5 decades ago. Not only his sight, but also his comrades, his dreams, and the person he once was. I don't know who authorized your presence here, Wellington continued, adjusting the cuffs of his designer shirt, but it was clearly a mistake. This is a $290,000 Bosendorfer Imperial. It's not for amateurs. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't back away. He simply turned his body toward the voice, his cloudy eyes fixed on some distant point. With disconcerting calm, he slowly sat down on the piano bench. The festival director, James Harrington, watched from the front row, uncomfortable but silent. The political connections and sponsorship Wellington brought were too valuable to risk. It was hard to imagine how Thomas had gotten there. The selection process for the festival was notoriously rigorous. Of the 1,200 pianists who had applied that year, only 14 had been selected for the main performances. And none of them were blind elderly men with no formal credentials. This is ridiculous, Wellington hissed to an assistant. Who does he think he is? Bach reincarnated. Thomas finally spoke, his calm voice betraying a slight southern accent. Mr. Wellington, with all due respect, I am here because I was invited. At least allow me to show you why. Wellington crossed his arms. You have 2 minutes. Not a second more. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had been in his modest apartment in Nashville, his fingers gliding over the old upright piano his late wife, Clara, had bought at an army auction. It was a piano with cigarette burns and coffee stains, but to Thomas it was more precious than any Steinway. Thomas had lost his sight in 1971 when his platoon was ambushed near Da Nang. An explosion took his eyesight, but paradoxically revealed another gift. During his long recovery in the military hospital, he discovered in the piano a new way of seeing the world, through sound vibrations, the musical textures his hypersensitive fingers could create. Clara had been his nurse during his rehabilitation. She suggested music as therapy when nightmares and post-traumatic stress threatened to consume him. Music is mathematics for the soul, she used to say. Thomas taught himself, guided more by intuition than formal technique. For 45 years, he played only for himself and Clara. When she passed away 8 months ago, the silence in the apartment became unbearable. For the first time, he began playing in small venues, a local cafe, Veterans Association events, charity parties. It was at one of these performances that Sarah Lindsay, a young doctoral student in musicology, heard him. Without Thomas knowing, she recorded his unique interpretation of Liszt and, against all odds, managed to get him included in the festival program through a friend in the organization. Now, sitting in front of the imposing Bosendorfer, Thomas placed his fingers on the keys. The hands that had once wielded a rifle now trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from anticipation. While everyone waited for the inevitable failure, a curious detail went unnoticed. Thomas had not asked for a Braille score. He had not requested a particular composer. He had not asked which piece he should play. A heavy silence hung in the air. Wellington glanced at his watch impatiently. Thomas took a deep breath and his fingers touched the first notes. The sound that emerged was not just music. It was a revelation. An original composition that began as a whisper, evoking the sounds of the Vietnamese jungle before dawn, distant birds, the gentle movement of foliage, the restrained breathing of young soldiers on watch. Wellington uncrossed his arms, his expression of disdain turning to confusion. Thomas played as if there were no tomorrow, as if each note were a memory translated into sound. There was a raw, visceral quality to his performance that no conservatory could teach. Gradually, everyone in the auditorium realized a disturbing truth. They were not just watching a blind veteran, they were witnessing something extraordinary, something their presumptions had almost silenced. Backstage, Sarah watched with a small smile. She knew what no one else there knew. Thomas Miller was not just an amateur pianist. He held a secret that would transform that moment of humiliation into the catalyst for one of the most extraordinary stories of musical redemption the world had ever witnessed. If Thomas's notes are already touching your heart, be sure to subscribe to find out how a forgotten veteran who lost everything in the war found a way to turn decades of silence into a symphony that would make even his fiercest critic bow down before his unquestionable talent. The final notes of Thomas's composition echoed through the empty auditorium as everyone remained in stunned silence. Wellington had allowed only 2 minutes, but no one dared interrupt. "That's enough," Wellington finally cut in, unable to hide the shock in his voice. "The 2 minutes are up. Thank you for the demonstration, but it doesn't change anything. This festival has standards." Thomas gathered his cane and rose with dignity. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." Sarah Lindsay, the doctoral student who had secretly entered Thomas, waited for him backstage. At 27, with short hair and a determined look, she represented a new generation of musicologists who were challenging the elitist conventions of the classical music world. "You were amazing," she whispered, guiding him out. Wellington is in a panic. "I've never seen that look on his face before." "It doesn't matter," Thomas replied. "I'm not here to impress people like him." On the way back to the hotel, Sarah drove while Thomas remained silent, his wrinkled hands resting on his cane. The weight of the years and the memories of Vietnam seemed more evident now. "How did you learn to play like that?" Sarah asked finally. "There's nothing like what I heard today." Thomas turned his face toward the window. "Do you know the expression, seeing through the darkness? For me, it's not a metaphor." 2 days later, Sarah knocked on Thomas's temporary apartment door carrying a thick folder and a laptop. "Good news and bad news," she announced. "Wellington convinced the committee to keep you off the official program, but I got something better." Thomas's voice came from the small kitchenette. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I've lived long enough to know that closed doors aren't the end of the journey." "It's not worry," Sarah replied, emotion raising her voice. "It's justice. And maybe a little revenge, too." She explained her plan. She had secured the historic St. Matthew's Church, just 2 blocks from the main auditorium, for Thomas to perform, at the same time as Wellington's recital. "It's crazy, I know," Sarah admitted. "But I have friends in the cultural media department. We'll broadcast it live on the internet." Thomas smiled as he poured the tea, not spilling a drop. "You're brilliant and stubborn, Sarah. You remind me of my Clara." The mention of his late wife was rare. Sarah seized the opening. "You never told me how Clara came into your life." Thomas touched the scar that ran down his right temple. "She taught me how to see again, in a way no one could have imagined." In the weeks that followed, Wellington intensified his disdain. In an interview with a classical music podcast, he referred to Thomas as a charity case trying to pass himself off as an artist. During an open rehearsal, when a journalist asked about the blind veteran, Wellington responded with a laugh, "Maybe we should have a special category for inspirational amateurs, next to the children's performances." What Wellington didn't know was that every disparaging word strengthened Thomas's determination and increased interest in his alternative recital. The night before the performance, Thomas and Sarah rehearsed in the empty church. His hands glided over the modest piano, drawing sounds that made the old wooden beams vibrate. "Are you sure this is what you want to play tomorrow?" Sarah asked. "It's so different. People expect Chopin, Beethoven." Thomas stopped, his fingers hovering over the keys. "When you lose your sight on the battlefield, Sarah, you learn that there are 2 kinds of darkness. The kind that imprisons you and the kind that sets you free. My music comes from the second kind." In Wellington's apartment, the pianist reviewed his scores, irritated by the distraction caused by that blind veteran. His assistant timidly entered the office. "Sir, I think you should see this." He showed him an article, "Musical Contrast, the Contested Virtuoso versus the Established Maestro, 2 performances, 1 turning point." Wellington threw the tablet on the table. "Ridiculous. Who's going to choose to listen to an amateur in an old church when they can hear me in the best auditorium in town?" "Online reservations for his performance have already exceeded the church's capacity," muttered the assistant. On the morning of the big day, Thomas woke up before dawn. He opened the small suitcase he had brought from Nashville and took out an aged wooden box, his most precious secret. Sarah found him already dressed, holding the box. "What's that?" "Something I've kept for almost 50 years, Thomas replied. "Today is the day to reveal it." The church was packed 2 hours before the start. Journalists and bloggers squeezed into the back while students set up cameras for the live broadcast. In the makeshift dressing room, Sarah noticed Thomas's growing nervousness. It wasn't stage fright, but something deeper. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, opening the wooden box. "Before I lost my sight in Vietnam, I wasn't just an ordinary soldier." Inside the box was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1964. The headline read, "Musical prodigy drops out of Juilliard to serve in the army. My country needs me more than music," says Miller. Sarah took the clipping with trembling hands. "My God, Thomas, you studied at Juilliard?" "For 3 years," he confirmed with a wistful smile. "Under the tutelage of the same man who now considers me unworthy of playing his precious Bosendorfer." The revelation hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. "Wellington was your teacher? He knows who you are." "He never really looked at me," Thomas replied, removing an old photograph from the box in which a promising young man in military uniform shook hands with a much younger Wellington. "Tonight isn't about revenge, Sarah. It's about redemption, his and mine." When the church doors opened at 7:30 p.m., the contrast could not have been more stark. In the prestigious Symphony Hall, Richard Wellington took to the stage to polite applause from a partially filled audience. Simultaneously, in the modest St. Matthew's Church, people jostled for every available inch, with dozens of cameras poised for the live broadcast. Wellington adjusted his impeccable tuxedo. "Tonight, I will perform Rachmaninoff with the respect and technique that classical music demands." A jab at the amateur veteran, whose alternative performance had stolen part of his usual audience. Thomas Miller was guided to the simple Yamaha piano in the church, his white cane marking the way. It was not a Bosendorfer Imperial. It was just a restored instrument, donated years ago. Sarah watched nervously. There are a lot of important people here. Critics, music bloggers, even conservatory teachers. Thomas smiled. "I'm not here for them." Sarah introduced Thomas briefly. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you will hear something that no music school could teach." A respectful silence filled the room as Thomas sat down at the piano. No score. No introduction. Just a blind man facing an instrument. His fingers touched the keys. The sound that emerged was not just music. It was confession. It was history. An original composition that began with notes that clearly evoked the rigorous academic style of Juilliard in the 1960s, a signature sound that any connoisseur would recognize immediately. In the audience, an elderly music critic frowned. "That sounds like Richard Wellington in his younger years." In Symphony Hall, Wellington was performing his first piece when his assistant approached him discreetly during a break. "Sir, something's going on. The veteran's performance is going viral. And they're sharing an old photo." "What photo?" Wellington whispered irritably. "You and a young soldier. They say the blind veteran was your student at Juilliard before Vietnam." Wellington's blood ran cold. "Impossible." On his tablet, the assistant showed him the photo circulating online, the same one from Thomas's wooden box. A young Thomas in military uniform shaking hands with a young Wellington at the beginning of his career. Wellington felt the world spin. Tommy Miller? My God. In the church, Thomas played a virtuoso passage, perfectly blending the technical classicism of Juilliard with the raw emotional expression that life had taught him. The entire church was in a trance. Sarah, backstage, cried silently. Thomas paused and spoke, his voice reaching every member of the audience. "This section is dedicated to my teacher Richard Wellington. He taught me that technical perfection is the supreme ideal of music. Life has taught me that emotional truth is what really matters." The live broadcast exceeded 50,000 viewers. Symphony Hall emptied quickly while St. Matthew's Church overflowed. A reporter from the New York Classical Review was already typing frantically, while Wellington recycles technically perfect but emotionally empty interpretations, his forgotten former student has just redefined contemporary music. In Symphony Hall, Wellington completely lost his concentration. Memories came flooding back, the brilliant student who had dropped out of Juilliard to serve in Vietnam, the harsh words he had directed at him, "You're wasting your talent on naive patriotism," the distant news that Tommy had been wounded in combat. Wellington had never sought to find out more. Other students came, careers were built, awards were won. Tommy Miller had become just a forgotten footnote in his long career. Until tonight. In the church, Thomas concluded his performance with a section that musically narrated his entire journey, from youthful promise to tragedy in Vietnam, from decades of silence to rebirth at this moment. The result was something that transcended classification, a musical testimony to an extraordinary life. When the last note faded, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, like a wave, the entire church rose in a deafening ovation. Shouts of bravo echoed off the ancient walls. At Symphony Hall, Wellington faced an audience reduced to less than a third of its capacity. His phone vibrated incessantly with notifications. In the middle of a passage, he missed a note. Then another. His composure visibly crumbled. "The board demands immediate clarification regarding Thomas Miller," read the urgent message from the Festival Council. In the church, Thomas spoke as the ovation died down. "I did not come here for revenge or humiliation. I came to share what I learned after the lights went out for me. True music does not need to be seen, it needs to be felt." Sarah approached with news of social media exploding. "What do you want to say to all those producers and record labels?" Thomas smiled. "Tell them that today I'm not playing for contracts or fame. I'm playing for Clara, who taught me to see again. And yes, I'm playing for Richard Wellington too, to show that there is beauty beyond perfection." The real victory wasn't in humiliating his former teacher, but in transforming tragedy into transcendence. The perfect revenge wasn't carried out with bitterness, but with beauty. The circle was complete, not with destruction, but with creation. As Thomas was led off the stage, he left behind something more powerful than resentment. He left a question that reverberated in the minds of everyone present. How many extraordinary talents remain invisible because the world decides who deserves to be heard based solely on what it can see? The next morning, Thomas Miller's performance had gone viral. The video had surpassed 2 million views in less than 12 hours. Music critics from respected publications such as the New York Times and The Guardian published enthusiastic reviews, describing her performance as a redefinition of what authentic virtuosity means and a testament to human resilience translated into musical notes. Wellington, on the other hand, faced what many called deserved cancellation. The festival board called an emergency meeting and, in an unprecedented decision, removed him from the lineup for the next 3 years. His record label issued a statement re-evaluating the partnership, and 3 universities suspended their invitations for masterclasses. "It's amazing how the tables have turned," Sarah commented as she showed Thomas the top stories on her tablet. "They're calling you the forgotten conscience of classical music." Thomas smiled serenely, his hands resting on the old wooden box. "I don't want Wellington to be destroyed, Sarah. I just wanted him to listen. Really listen." The phone wouldn't stop ringing. The prestigious Deutsche Grammophon offered an exclusive recording contract. Lincoln Center sent an invitation to a series of special recitals. Even the Juilliard Conservatory, in a symbolic gesture, announced the creation of the Thomas Miller Scholarship for war veterans interested in musical studies. In his luxurious apartment, Wellington stared at the television screen, watching Thomas's CNN interview for the 3rd time. The veteran spoke without bitterness, explaining how music had become his salvation after the tragedy in Vietnam. "When I lost my sight," Thomas said on the screen, "I gained a new way of listening. Not just with my ears, but with my whole body, with my memory, with pain transformed into sound." Wellington turned off the TV and walked over to his Steinway. He sat down, but couldn't play. For the first time in 40 years, the keys seemed mute under his technically perfect fingers. 3 months later, Thomas opened a small adaptive music school in Nashville. With money from contracts and sponsorships, he created a space where people with disabilities could find a new form of expression in music. Clara would have approved. Sarah, now his assistant and director of the foundation, coordinated the program, which already served dozens of veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and visually impaired children. "I have something to show you," she said one fall afternoon, leading Thomas to the school reception area. "What is it?" he asked, feeling the cool air coming in through the windows. "A letter. From Richard Wellington." Thomas nodded quietly. "Read it to me." The letter was brief, handwritten on personalized stationery. Thomas. I spent decades teaching perfect technique, but you showed me that I forgot to teach the most important thing, the soul of music. I am relearning how to listen. If you would allow me, I would like to visit your school. Not to teach. Clearly I am the one who needs to learn. Wellington. Thomas smiled, remembering the ambitious young teacher he had met so many years ago. Tell him he'll be welcome. Music is generous, it always offers second chances. Wellington arrived 2 weeks later, looking visibly different. His impeccable suit had been replaced by simple clothes. His arrogance had given way to an almost uncomfortable humility. In the school's small concert hall, he watched Thomas work with a group of blind children. He wasn't just teaching technique, he was teaching them to feel the music, to find beauty in imperfections, to transform limitations into unique expression. When Thomas sat down at the piano that evening, with Wellington in the front row, he didn't play to impress. He played to heal. The notes spoke of loss, war, darkness, but also of renewal and forgiveness. At the end, Wellington approached him, tears in his eyes. You could have destroyed me completely. Revenge would have blinded me twice, Thomas replied. I chose to turn pain into something better. Thomas Miller's true victory was not in humiliating Wellington or achieving late fame. It was in redefining the very meaning of vision in the world of music. While one sought technical perfection at any cost, the other found the authenticity that can only be achieved by navigating the deepest shadows of human experience. The two men, teacher and student, separated by war and reunited by music, became living symbols of how true virtuosity transcends what the eye can see. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to sign up for more stories that show how true greatness is often born in the most unlikely places, and how the best revenge is never to destroy your opponent. It is to transcend the limitations he tried to impose on you by creating something so beautiful that even your harshest critics have no choice but to bow down before the undeniable truth of your talent.